Hello, and thank you for joining me on this short video, Prevention of Cross-Contamination. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. Now this is the 71st of 100 short videos that I'm recording on UK food law topics. You may be watching this as part of our online training service, in which case you'll have access to a whole range of additional resources, including webinars and online training courses, etc. But if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, you are of course very welcome. Now I'm talking about cross-contamination, or for our US viewers, cross-contact. Basically what I'm talking about is the contamination of food that is ready to eat by food poisoning bacteria or food allergens, of course. So I'm talking about the contamination of food that is actually been through a process or is ready to be consumed by the final consumer. Now there are two ways that food can be contaminated in broad categories. There's by direct contamination. So you have, for example, raw meat, a beef joint, for example, placed on the top shelf of a fridge and blood drips down onto a salad below. You've got direct contamination from the raw meat, which is likely to contain food poisoning bacteria, to the food that is going to be eaten without any further processing or heat treatment or any other sort of measure to prevent the food poisoning bacteria causing illness in the consumer. That's direct. But there is indirect cross-contamination as well. And indirect, well, it has many facets. It could be, for example, you get your raw beef joint, you place it onto a work surface, and then you pick it up and put it somewhere else, and then maybe put a salad on that work surface. So the salad becomes contaminated from potentially food poisoning bacteria on the work surface, but also if the food handler hasn't taken any preventative measures like washing hands, may well be contaminated from the food handler. Now, the indirect cross-contamination can occur from many sources. I'm going to talk about largely that in a moment, because direct contamination is actually very easy to control. You know, if you're putting food into a fridge, you make sure you don't put raw foods on the top shelf, you put them on the bottom shelf. You make sure that any foods that are likely to contain contaminants are properly sealed, properly contained. So preventative measures to prevent direct cross-contamination are relatively straightforward. It's the indirect that becomes a bit more complex. Now I should say that you might get pests as well. They can be vectors. In other words, they can be the causative way that food poisoning bacteria moved around a food room or a food business. So you could have, for example, a mouse directly contaminating food by defecating in it, pooing in it, or you might get a mouse running across some, I don't know, raw meat or something, and then across some work surface, contaminating those work surfaces. So you end up with indirect contamination. Okay, well, I'm not going to explore the differences between indirect and direct too much, other than to say the indirect is a little bit more complicated to control. Now, the photograph behind me is just an example of indirect cross-contamination. There are many issues to spot here. You've got raw chicken, and if you've got a piece of raw poultry, like a raw chicken, you should assume that it's contaminated with salmonella, Campylobacter being the main types of food poisoning bacteria that are likely to be present. If you're not familiar with those, there are separate videos on each of those topics. So you can assume the raw chicken is contaminated. So by putting it onto a draining surface like this, that surface has now become contaminated. You see a little cloth beside it. That cloth is likely to become contaminated. And of course, you know, you could indirectly contaminate another work surface by picking that cloth up and spreading it across a work surface. You can indirectly contaminate a food handler by them touching that cloth that's been in contact with a raw chicken. Behind it, you can see a tap. Washing raw poultry is a definite no-no. The Food Standards Agency have advised for many years that it's inappropriate to wash raw poultry. The reason is that the poultry is likely to be contaminated with food poisoning bacteria, and if you stick them in a sink like this and start splashing water, the water will splash onto the surfaces, onto the walls, onto other areas, basically spreading the contamination around that area. So this is just an example where indirect cross-contamination can occur. Someone can remove that raw chicken now, but leave the contamination on that surface. They may put ready-to-eat food on there. They may put cutlery that's been washed up and ready to be used by consumers. The sink itself, the taps may be contaminated. The whole area may be cross-contaminated. Okay, so a simple message on preventing cross-contamination is, of course, hand washing. Hand washing is a very effective way of reducing the risk of food poisoning from cross-contamination. And the traditional message on this is, if you're a food handler, it doesn't matter if you're in a manufacturing environment or in a catering environment, if you're handling sources of food poisoning bacteria such as raw meat, raw poultry, for example, or if you're going to the toilet, then you should always wash your hands before handling food. It's a simple message, it is effective. However, that simple preventive measure is easily undermined. And it's undermined because, well, if you think in a kitchen environment, you haven't just got hand washing and handling food, you might be handling cleaning materials. So you might go to the toilet, pick up some cleaning materials that are stored in the toilet and go and clean a work surface that you then put some cooked meats on. If that's the case, you've got indirect cross-contamination. You may well be handling raw chicken, and when you're raw chicken you put it into the fridge. Now you've just touched the fridge handle. Someone who's washed their hands might then go and take some salad out of the fridge. They touch the same handle, they've cross-contaminated their hands, and then they might go and handle ready-to-eat food. You might get, you're cutting raw chicken and the phone rings, so you pick up the phone. You've now handled that. Someone else might pick up the phone to take an order for maybe a ready-to-eat food, but now they've now become contaminated from the phone. It may be that you're putting raw vegetables into the fridge. So again, you're handling the same handle that the person who handled raw chicken handled. And maybe in some raw vegetables, soily vegetables, you might get sources of E. coli 157, for example, and it's very easily transmitted. You may be using a dishwasher and you're putting dirty dishes in the dishwasher, and then you close it up and you start it up. Your hands are all dirty. What about the person who comes along to unload the dishwasher, whose hands were clean, but of course handling the dishwasher? What about if you're cutting the chicken and you cut your finger? You go to the first aid box and you're dripping blood all over it, but you've also got juices all over it. You put a bandage or a plaster on your finger, and then you go to the fridge and you cross-contaminate the fridge. Somebody else might be coming along to take some more stuff out. Maybe during all of this you might just fancy a coffee, so having handled the fridge, got contamination on your hand, you now handle the cup, and then you go and handle some ready-to-eat food. You can see how this becomes incredibly difficult, because in real life handling stuff, moving about, is just impossible to control. Now, a number of studies have been carried out by the Food Standards Agency over the last 10, 15 years, and they've all pointed in the same direction. If you're doing hand washing, that is a very, very effective way of preventing cross-contamination. But in the screen behind me, you can see all these arrows all over the place. These are areas where that preventative measure is being bypassed, because you're washing your hands. But if you had to wash your hands every time you touch the fridge, every time you touch the dishwasher, every time you touch the cleaning materials, you'd be forever washing your hands. It would be just impossible in a catering environment to actually just operate normally. Too much washing hands means that effectively the hand washing becomes ineffective, because many studies have shown that the more times you ask a food handler to perform an intervention like hand washing or disinfection, the more times you ask them to do it, the less effective it becomes. So one of the major strategies to prevent cross-contamination in any food environment, a food processing, food manufacturing, catering environment, is to cut down the number of times that you need to wash hands, cut down the number of times that you need to disinfect work surfaces, because the fewer times you have to wash hands, the more effective the hand washing will be, and therefore the more effective it will be in preventing cross-contamination. So what does that mean in practice? Well, the key messages to prevent cross-contamination in any food environment, manufacturing to catering, is first of all physical separation. If you can keep raw and ready-to-eat foods separate, then you are cutting down the need for hand washing. If you're in a manufacturing plant and you have, a ready-to-eat processing area, you typically refer to it as a high-risk area. food handlers going into that high-risk area would have to go through scrupulous hygiene measures, including hand washing. But they would only be handling ready-to-eat food. If you're in, say, a sandwich factory and you've got the assembly of ready-to-eat sandwiches, the food handlers in there would be, I say, adopting scrupulous hygiene measures. But because they're working in a clean environment, they won't have to wash their hands every few minutes every time they do anything. Similarly, if you're in a manufacturing environment, you put your raw preparation and processing areas separate from your ready-to-eat ones. In a factory, that's easily done. And the first and most important preventative measure in preventing cross-contamination is physical separation. But if you're in a small restaurant or a small takeaway, how do you go about that? Well, obviously, the first principle is to have separate rooms for ready-to-eat foods and raw foods. But if you're in a small business, that might be completely impractical. Okay, if you're in a single room, you need to have separate areas. You need to have clean and designated clean areas and areas where you're going to have raw food handled. So one side of the room might be for raw food, one side for ready-to-eat food. If staff are moving from one to the other, there should be hand washing put in place, for example. If you can't do that, well, at the very least, if you're using the same work surface to handle ready-to-eat foods and raw foods, you can do time separation. Do your ready-to-eat foods first. So in the morning, you prepare your desserts and things like that. And then after that, you might be handling raw foods. So your desserts are all put away nice and safely. But in addition to that, if you're using the same work surface to handle, for example, raw meat and ready-to-eat foods, well, you should put some physical separation. Use chopping boards. Chopping boards that are properly disinfected, so that if I'm using a work surface now, I'm putting a beef joint on there, I will put the beef joint not on the work surface, I put it on a chopping board. The chopping board would have been properly cleaned and disinfected using a commercial dishwasher. The work surface would be disinfected using a sanitizer. Once I've finished using the raw meat, of course I'll be washing hands in terms of the food handler, but I'll also re-disinfect the work surface and use a new chopping board. So if I'm preparing salad, the salad is not in contact with the same work surface. It's only in contact with a separate chopping board, but the chopping board is on a disinfected work surface and the food handlers are washing hands in between. So you've got physical separation in that way. But it is a hierarchy. You start off trying to do it in a different room. You try and do it in separate areas of a room if you can't do different rooms. And lastly, if you are going to be doing it on the same work surface, use time separation, physical separation. Hand washing forms an important part of this, as does disinfection. But as I said, you want to cut down the number of times that it will be necessary to wash hands and necessary to disinfect, so that you can ensure that both processes are actually effective. And you need to have documented procedures on that. Systems based on HACCP principles should set out how this is going to be achieved in practice. If you're a caterer, you may be using the Food Standards Agency's Safe Food, Better Business to set out safe methods. If you're in manufacturing, you may have proper detailed procedures on how cross-contamination can be prevented. But in essence, it is all about separating the operations. I showed a complicated diagram earlier on where there's arrows flying everywhere because every time you touch something there is potential for indirect cross-contamination. On this diagram we've simplified it. We've split the area into two. So this could be like a catering establishment. On one area, one side of the room we're handling raw food. On one side of the room we're handling ready-to-eat food. If we move from one to the other, then we'll wash our hands. If we're going to the toilet, for example, we'll clearly wash our hands in between. Because we're working in raw areas and ready-to-eat areas, there is no need for hand washing every time you touch the fridge in the raw area because you've got a separate fridge for your ready-to-eat food. So there's no need to keep washing your hands every time you touch it. But you do need to wash your hands when you go to common areas, such as the wash-up areas. If you're putting dirty stuff into your dishwasher or into your sink, then you need to have hand washing and disinfection procedures to prevent somebody working in the clean area coming along becoming contaminated. Okay, look, there's just a few thoughts on preventing cross-contamination. That's just one out of 100 videos that I'm recording. I hope you'll join me on the next one. Thank you for watching.